Hey, and welcome to Be the Bridge. I'm your host, Peyton Joyner. From the time I was 11, I tried to pray away the gay. But my senior year in college, I realized I could pray and be gay. Each week, I'll share my experiences and chat with others as we build a bridge between the LGBT community and people of faith. Thanks for joining, and let the construction begin. Hello, fellow bridge builders. Thank y'all for joining me today for this 18th episode of Be the Bridge podcast. I'm your host, Peyton Joyner, author of the novel, The Wisdom of Stones. The novel's about Ben, a college senior, who promised God and his meemaw he'd be a Southern Baptist preacher, but he can't pray away the gay. In the novel, Ben goes to the chaplain on his university's campus to seek guidance and help in his struggle with his sexual orientation. When I was a senior in college, I went to the chaplain on my campus. I hoped that he would guide me through a program where I could do away with my sexual attractions towards men. I was engaged to a woman at the time, and I hoped to truly be able to find that sexual attraction for her that was missing. But the chaplain didn't give me the help I wanted. Instead, he told me that I could be gay and Christian, and that changed the trajectory of my life. On today's episode, I won't have a guest. Instead, I wanted to share with you some reflections and thoughts that I have about what it means to be gay and Christian with regards to sexual ethics. This past weekend, I attended the Gay Christian Network Conference, or the Q Christian Fellowship, in Denver, Colorado. It's an annual conference with over 1,000 members of the LGBTQIA community and their allies gathered together around a shared love for Jesus Christ. I met some wonderful folks who will be featured in future podcasts, but for this week, I thought I'd share with you one of my main takeaways from that conference. What would a code of sexual ethics look like for a gay Christian? In the past, the Gay Christian Network had two main camps. There was a Side A and a Side B. Side A was the overwhelming majority, I would say on my loose calculations of talking with people, 90+%. Side A Christians believe that the biblical interpretation, the scriptures, our understanding of the Bible verses that say homosexual sin is to be condemned aren't really speaking to our current concept of two people of the same gender falling in love and being in a committed monogamous relationship. So for Side A, they would support marriage equality and believe that gay sex is not necessarily immoral, although they would believe that rampant sexual promiscuity, whether it's between members of the same sex or opposite gender, would be immoral. Side B people are those who believe that homosexual sex is always sinful and is prohibited by the Bible, but they don't believe that a change in sexual orientation is possible. It's really easy to frame a code of sexual ethics for Side B. You can be gay, you can have that orientation, but by God, you don't act on it. For Side A, there's a much broader range of what constitutes acceptable sexual activity. Now, when I first came out, I decided that I would live my life as a gay man the same way that I had when I was straight. I would approach dating the same way, I would approach relationships the same way. So for me, that meant I didn't go to bars, I wouldn't have random hookups, and I might date someone, of course someone I'd met other than at a bar, but we wouldn't have sex until we were quote-unquote married or whatever committed relationship status we might have been able to cobble together back in the early 90s. I imagined that my code of sexual ethics would be grounded primarily as much as possible in the scriptures. So what would that have looked like? And what did that look like for me? For me, it meant that I set boundaries. There was a list of things that I could and couldn't do, and that list was very comprehensive. Strict adherence to that list of do's and don'ts would mean and be the determining factor of whether I was living my life in accordance with what I believed to be God's plan for me at that point. It was essentially what we have today in this purity culture, but I sort of call it purity for the homosexual. And so often our notion of sexual ethics have been guided by this principle of setting boundaries. If you fall outside that boundary, you're a terrible, horrible person, and you're no longer pure. Is there any redemption for you? Any salvation? I don't know. I think that notion of sexual ethics is somewhat problematic because it just creates this pattern of shame and this pattern of constantly feeling like a failure and like you are never able to really be the person that you are because you're so afraid you might have one misstep and that misstep is going to taint you and you're going to be a completely different person at that moment and then also for the rest of your life. So if we look at a boundaries-based sexual ethics, I think it's clear that for most of us, we really see a lot of problems there. One of the big issues is once you are no longer pure, why even bother with the boundaries? Once I'd gone to the bar, once I'd had that random hookup, once I had sex with the guy that I'd met at the bar that was not with me in a long-term serious relationship, then suddenly nothing mattered. I had no more standards. I had no more need to follow any sort of principles in any way to try and have a positive sexual ethic. One of the things that was discussed very often at this conference was what would a Christ-centered, a biblical, a Christian sexual ethics look like? At one of the events, we were asked the question, do you want to base your sexual ethics primarily on the Bible? And you had to say whether you strongly agreed with that, whether you agreed with that, whether you disagreed with that, or whether you strongly disagreed with that. I'll be honest, my initial reaction was that I strongly disagreed with that. I don't see the Bible as a really great how-to guide for 21st century living as a gay man in America. I just don't see that a lot of the things that are in there were really that applicable to me because I think so much of what I was taught about the Bible was really grounded in this notion of Levitical law. This is a sin. This is punishable by death. This is an abomination. This is what's going to send you to hell. But over the course of the workshop, the very wise instructor sort of looked instead at the values that are contained in the Bible. And important for me in my faith is the principle that Jesus has laid out in that golden rule. And of course, that's do unto others as you would have them do unto you. In another presentation at the conference, a speaker talked about establishing a sexual ethics that would have two guiding principles. One, consent. I think very clearly in this day and age of Me Too and sexual harassment, we all recognize that consent has to be first and foremost the starting point of your sexual ethics. And that's why I think it's very clear that as a gay man, I am not somehow on a slippery slope towards having sex with animals and children because first and foremost is consent. Animals and children can't provide that consent. This notion that somehow if you accept gay people and you allow them to love each other and to have sex, that somehow that's a Pandora's box. It's a slippery slope for all sorts of sexual depravity that's going to end life and civilization as we know it, just isn't true. Because fundamental to this notion of sexual ethics for the gay community, as it is in the straight community, and obviously we have outliers in both, but consent is a critical component of that. But not only is consent just important, but there's also this notion of mutuality. And that was one thing that I hadn't really thought of, but it's embedded and inherent in that golden rule. It's do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And the example was given of someone who may have a sexual addiction, they may have an issue where whenever they get into a difficult situation in their life, whenever they need validation, they will use their bodies to achieve that validation. They'll go out and hook up with someone and have sex with someone just so they can get that validation. I will admit that is something that I have done in my life before. I'm not proud of those moments, but it's something that's happened. Even though I have fully consented in that regard, and even though someone might fully consent, is that other person really acting according to the golden rule? Are they hooking up or are they having sex with someone on this notion of mutuality. And by mutuality, I mean, is this relationship, is this physical activity mutual beneficial for both parties? Or is it something where even though consent is freely given between the two parties, it is actually doing more harm to one party or the other? And the example that I gave with regards to someone who has sex when they just want to have their ego stroked, when they need validation, when things are rough for them in their life, I think it's very incumbent on the other person to consider that and to really maybe think about what this type of physical activity is going to do. Is it going to be something that is going to be mutually beneficial for those parties? And I think if we look at a new sexual ethic, a sexual ethic for the 21st century that can work for the gay community, the straight community, and LGBTQIA+, and everything in this world, then I think if we're guided by these notions of consent and mutuality, then maybe we can move forward beyond this purity, just say no, abstinence program that just really hasn't worked. Curious what you guys think about this, if it's something that you've ever thought about before. I certainly hadn't. But it's something that I think as I think about what sexual ethics would look like, and something where I can feel comfortable and say that my sexual ethics are grounded in the Bible, I think it's this notion of thinking about everything, and not just consent, but also thinking about the entire situation is what can guide me further in my life. Thank you so much for listening to this very different podcast, and I am excited to roll out some very interesting speakers as we go forward over the next few weeks. Thank you for joining the conversation today. If you want to talk more, check me out on Facebook or go to brianpeytonjoyner.com/podcast and leave a comment. Thanks so much and have a great day. Thanks for listening to Be the Bridge. If you enjoyed the show, I'd love a positive rating and review on iTunes. I appreciate your support and feedback. For more details, visit brianpeytonjoyner.com or follow me on Facebook or Twitter. The links are in the show notes. Have a great week. And as my grandpa used to say, if you live life by your own rules, you're gonna be okay.